And now at the end of my agony.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Dram Show with me, Chris Goodrum. Right, okay, from the title screen you're probably wondering just what is going on here. Well, the simple answer is this. After last week's episode of the show on a selection of random whiskies, I thought, let's do it again, but this time let's make it really, really random. So we've got two whiskies from Canada. We've got one from Sweden, not the obvious one from Sweden. We have one from Denmark, and we've got one from Bavaria. So, whoa, how random is that, shall we say? Obviously, I'm not going to go into huge detail about each of the distilleries because we'll be here all night if we do, and we want to taste some whiskey, really, don't we? But I'll introduce each whiskey. I'll give you a little bit of information about the whiskey, the distillery, and we'll get on and then we'll taste them and see what they're like. So so let's introduce this afternoon's random lineup then. Right, okay, so the first whiskey we'll be looking at is called the Collingwood Canadian whiskey. It's bottled at 40%. Now, it is distilled at the Canadian Mist Distillery, which is owned by Brown-Forman, under the watchful eye of a guy called Chris Morris, who's the master distiller there. Now, this is quite an interesting whiskey. It's a blended whiskey, and both spirits are distilled at the distillery. The first spirit is a corn-based spirit. It's made from, or the mash bill is made from Ontario corn and malted barley. And the second spirit is quite a high rye content spirit. That's all I could find out about that. Both the spirits are triple distilled in a copper column still, and then they're blended together. Now, you might think, oh, that's fairly interesting, but here's the really interesting bit about it. Basically, Brown-Forman, obviously, as you know, owns Woodford's Reserve, and Woodford's Reserve apparently released a maple finish bottling, a maple finished bourbon, and that got them to thinking, why don't we do the same sort of thing with our Canadian whiskey? So, but they put a twist on it. So they ordered in a number of 100% hard maple wood staves, and instead of remaking them into barrels and using that to do a sort of secondary maturation period in those barrels, what they decided to do was to take the staves and put them in the blending tank, in the stainless steel blending tank, which is apparently quite bizarre when you think about it. So, so here we have a Canadian blended whiskey, which has been finished off in stainless steel casks with bits of maple wood floating around in it. Okay, could be really interesting. Could be a recipe for disaster. Who knows? We shall find out. The second whiskey we'll be looking at, the second Canadian whiskey we'll be looking at, is the 40 Creek Evolution, bottled at 43%. Now, apparently the 40 Creek distillery was founded in 1992 by a chap called John K. Walker, who spent about 20 years in the wine industry and then decided he wanted to make whiskey. So it's based in a place called Grimsby, Ontario. Grimsby. Okay, can you imagine a distillery in Grimsby? Well, okay, I'll leave that one with you. Now, the Evolution is apparently the 8th special release that this particular distillery does. The standard bottling is called the Barrel Select, and is made from a mash of rye, barley and corn. Quite interesting. Now, so, and it gets even more interesting. Each of these grains is mashed, fermented and distilled separately. It's then aged for between 6 and 10 years, and then they blend the contents together to get desired outcome. It's aged primarily in 40-gallon American white oak casks, so that's obviously the standard distillery bottling. So when you think about it, you know, you've got these sort of three different cereal types. You've obviously got different ages you can pick from, and they do individual releases. I don't know whether they do them every year, but like I was saying, this is the 8th release, which was 9,000 bottles. Now, bear with me here because it gets even weirder, it has to be said. So basically, they take 3-year-old spirit, 3-year-old rye, barley and corn spirit. They then obviously blend that together. That's all been aged in American oak, and then they redistill it. Okay, so they redistill it, and then they stick it in, get this, French oak Cabernet Sauvignon casks for 9 years. For something that's spent 9 years in a Cabernet Sauvignon cask, I mean, it's got a nice sort of coppery colour hue, but you'd expect it to possibly be a bit darker. So wow, you know, that's a bit kind of left field, really, isn't it? That particular whiskey. So again, could be a complete and utter recipe for disaster, but you know, we shall find out. On to the third bottling. Now this is the Slurs, and I think I've pronounced that right. The Slurs Sherry Edition number 1 Pedro Ximenez finish, bottled at 46%. Now apparently this is the Slurs distillery is based in Bavaria in Germany. This particular bottling was the bottling that won Best European Single Malt in the World Whisky Awards 2014, and that's where the sample comes from. The distillery itself was founded in 2007 by a chap called Florian Stetter, hopefully I've pronounced that correctly, who was a brewer at the Hof Brewery in Mischbach. Again, I hope I pronounced that right, my German's not that great. And I believe that he was in Islay, I think, and made a bet with somebody of a crate of beer, Bavarian beer, that he couldn't produce a Bavarian whiskey, and lo and behold, he has indeed done so. So again, could be quite interesting. The fourth whiskey we'll be looking at is this one. It's called the Smogen Svensk Primor. It was distilled in 2010 and bottled 3 years later, so it's pretty young. It's a whopping 67.3%. So the distillery is the brainchild of a chap called Pa Caldenby, who incidentally, I just reached to my left here, wrote this particular book called Enjoying Malt Whisky, and he obviously enjoyed malt whisky so much that he decided that he wanted to make it himself. So the distillery was set up on a farm on the west coast of Sweden, slightly north of Gothenburg. The spirit is aged in a combination of new European oak and former Bordeaux casks. So again, as you can see, that is an awful lot darker. So that's the sort of colour I would expect something that's spent 9 years in a Cabernet Sauvignon cask to have. But no, that's spent 3 years. So could be quite an interesting whiskey. And like I said, this is not Macmara, another Swedish distillery to look at. And finally, we'll be looking at this baby, which is the Stauning Peated 2nd edition, bottled at 55%. The Stauning distillery is in Denmark. The spirit itself is made from Danish malted barley, Danish rye, and they use Danish peat. So how much more Danish can you get, I guess? The distillery began production in 2006, and I think it was set up by a group of 8 or nine friends, and I think just one of them runs the actual distillery, and the other 8 kind of do stuff around the distillery. I don't think that I think they all have professions other than doing the distillery, so I think it's kind of almost like a part-time thing. But so there you have it. That's the Stauning. So this is going to be a really interesting tasting. I think it's certainly going to be pretty different. So let's crack on and start with the Canadians then, shall we? Right, okay, so kicking off with the Collingwood. Let's see what the nose gives us on this one. It's very grainy. I mean, I remember this is one of the whiskies that I tasted for the whiskey magazine, and tasting it blind, I thought this was a grain whiskey, a pure grain whiskey, and obviously didn't know anything about what it was at all, and I've only just recently sort of obviously looked into the background of it for this episode of the show, and obviously I was not that far off the mark. I mean, obviously it is it's a blend. It's distilled in a column still, so it'll have that grainy kind of character, which it certainly has. It's very young, or certainly appears to be quite young. A little bit of dried fruit. It's a moderate amount of oak. Sort of slightly gritty. There's a little sweetness in the background, a little bit of honey, possibly, which is obviously coming from the maple oak. A little bit of coffee coming through. It's a pleasant nose. It's certainly got a crispness and an intensity, and I often find a lot of Canadian whiskies do have a tendency to be very grain-like, should we say, in their character, and this one is certainly no exception. There's a bit of fatness coming through now, a bit of vanilla, but it's certainly all about the grainy spirit character. Palate? That is really sweet. A lot of toffee, a lot of oak, a little bit of coffee, butter, caramel. I'm not getting a huge amount of grain. I'm not getting a huge amount of spirit. Full stop. I mean, it's there. It's nipping at the edges. I'm getting that graininess at the edge. But again, when I wrote the conclusion to this, I thought this was a fairly youngish grain whiskey that just succumbed to the oak, and I think that's pretty much a fair appraisal. I think there's a lot of oak, a lot of butteriness, sweetness. Yeah, I guess you could say there's a bit of sort of mapley kind of syrupy kind of character, but I'm not getting a lot of spirit. I'm not getting a lot of grain. So it's pleasant. It's not an unpleasant whiskey. It's quite nice, but it just doesn't quite have that complexity element, I think. So, but it's a good start, I think.
Give me a chance to find my real destiny.
Okay, so on to the 40 Creek then. Let's see what the nose gives us on this. Whoa, there's some serious oak going on here. Gritty, hard, winey, red fruits, oak, more oak. Oh, that's got some tannins as well. I mean, I guess it's not a surprise since spending 9 years in a Cabernet Sauvignon cask. There's a little bit of sweetness there, and I think I remember when I nosed this the first time, I was kind of in a sort of possibly wine cask finished sherry matured whiskey, because it has that sort of broad, almost sherry kind of rich character to it, but obviously it's not got any sherry. So obviously all that richness is coming from the Cabernet Sauvignon casks. It's a little high toned. Apparently the spirit that's in this is about 12 years old. Certainly feels a bit younger than that. I mean, it's pleasant enough, but I think it's obviously the wine cask that's the sort of focal point, the dominating factor in this particular whisky. Palate? Ooh, I'm getting gritty tannins at the end there. A little bit of alcohol as well. It's big, it's rich, dark fruits, black currants, lots of licorice, a little bit of toffee, a little bit of that sort of slightly toffee molasses kind of thing. Very, very tannic, a lot of tannin. I mean, yeah, it's pleasant. Not going to sort of say that it isn't. It's a little bit overly tannic. I think I would say it's possibly been over matured in the wine casks. Really dries up the finish. A lot of tannin, but it's pleasant enough. I'm not getting a great deal of spirit character. It has to be said. I'm not getting anything from, you know, all the different components, the corn, the barley, and the rye. And there's a little bit of spice, I guess. But again, it's all about the oak, and it's all about the sort of the finishing cask, the Cabernet Sauvignon cask. That's where the majority of the character is coming from. But again, yeah, not a bad whiskey. Okay, so on to the Slurs PX Finish. Let's see what the nose gives us then, shall we? Now, I'm guessing this hasn't spent a huge amount of time in the PX cask, because it doesn't have the sort of the big, winey, molassy kind of sherry, sweet sherry character that you would expect from a Pedro Ximénez finish. It's quite young. It's obviously got that slight high-toned, off-the-stilly kind of character. A little estery, getting a bit of pineapple, a bit of dusty spice, a bit of banana. It's actually quite elegant. I think it's I think this is a really interesting spirit. I mean, you know, like I was saying, I don't think this is particularly old. I wouldn't have put it much more than say 5. It's young. I think it just needs a bit of time, a bit more time actually. And I think what they've done is they've given it a quick finish in the PX casks to give it a little bit more body, a bit more weight, and not overdo it. I mean, so I think the balance of using the finishing cask is pretty good. It's just I'd like to see a little bit more maturity, I think, in the spirit. Palate? That's a chewy, malty PX Dram. I'm getting a lot more of the PX character now on the palate. A sort of burnt raisin, molasses, dark treacle. The spirit sort of kind of comes through a little bit on the end with a slightly sort of light apple, but again the focus is well and truly on the PX cask here. It's all, like I said, that sort of burnt raisin and sweet sort of molassy treacle. It's not a bad whiskey, but again, like the 40 Creek, it's all about the cask, and I love the nose. I thought the nose was really good. I'd just like to have seen a little bit more of the estery sort of spirit character coming through, but again, not bad at all. Right, okay, and on to the Swedish whiskey. Let's see what this gives us. Oh, that's a pungent nose. Fair amount of peat on this. Slightly medicinally, a little bit of iodine. 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 A little b kind of chunky, but sort of not overt sherry. A little bit of spicy red fruit. A little bit of barley coming through. You know, I think that's a really well balanced nose. I'm certainly getting all the elements. I'm getting the elements of the spirit. I'm getting the elements of the two different cask types. I'm getting a little bit of peat. And it's pretty intense. But for saying that, I mean, what was the alcohol? 60, 63.7. It doesn't smell like it. It's certainly not got that sort of nose prickly intensity that you would have thought it would have had. I'm guessing maybe that the wine casks and the sherry casks are kind of taken the edge off. They've certainly given it a nice gloss, it has to be said. Quite spicy now, lovely earthy kind of spice character. Palate. Oh my God, that's dry. Now you get the alcohol. Wow, that comes through on the finish. There isn't much of a finish at all in actual fact because of the alcohol. It certainly takes your breath away, as we said. A lot of sherry cask character, a lot of the sort of raisins, walnut, prune, a little bit of spicy red fruit. Not a little bit of peat now kind of comes through right on the aftertaste. I mean, it's been, you know, a good sort of what, 20 seconds, I guess. It's been since the mouth has kind of calmed down a little bit, and I'm now getting some of that earthy peat and spice. Again, not getting a huge amount of spirit character, but it's got some intensity. It has to be said. Let's put a little drop of water with it and see what that does to it, shall we? It does sort of flatten the nose a little bit. Mind you, in saying that, it certainly brings out some oils. It brings out that kind of a light herbal note, sort of an almost kind of celery-like note. Still quite spicy, softer, maybe a little bit more toffee now. Probably a little bit winier maybe. Yeah, it's nice. Like I said, again, I think the nose on this is really, really appealing. Let's see what the palate's like. Better, a lot softer, obviously, mitigating that intense alcohol. Certainly brought out this real herbal character, which I'm guessing is the spirit character. Not quite so much peat now. The peat isn't particularly heavy. I think it's pretty lightly peated. I think can't remember what the peating level was. 45 parts per million, so actually quite heavily peated in relative terms. But the peat does seem to have sort of disappeared off now once you put water with it. It's softer. I'm getting more spirit character, less wininess, less sherry. That's nice. The peat is there on the finish with that sort of slightly dusty, charcoaly, spicy kind of character. And yeah, I think that's really appealing. Get a little bit of mocha there, a little bit of chocolate. I think certainly putting a little drop of water with that opens it up, and certainly gives it a little bit more complexity. So yeah, I think that's pretty impressive spirit. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Stauning Peated then, bottled at 55%. Let's see what the nose gives us. Intense, a little bit soapy, quite quite peated, although not hugely so, but it's got a good degree of peat. Quite oily. Again, the spirit is very, very young. It's youthful. Bit of dusty spice, a bit of earthy peat. I mean, I guess this is probably not peated to much more than about 30 maybe parts per million. There's a little bit of a fishiness possibly. No real saltiness. Well, maybe just a smidge, but it's young. And the peat is the pretty much the focal point of this nose anyway. Out. Really young. I get a lot of that sort of off the still kind of character, a lot of that oiliness, not a lot of much other than some peat coming through on the finish, a bit dusty, and obviously I think the spirit is good spirit. I'm just not getting any real complexity other than sort of young spirit and peat really. I don't really get a great deal of cask interaction. It's obviously just not spent long enough in a cask to sort of like really pull out the vanillins. It's a bit dry. Let's put a little drop of water with it and see if that does anything for it. Yeah, that makes it really, really young. Bit rubbery, a little bit fainty, oily. Yeah, that's not done it any real favours at all, I don't think. Ooh, rubbery, sugar water. Quite stringent, bitter, getting a lot of bitterness. No real peat. Peat seems to have disappeared off somewhere. Yeah, that's. I mean, it's not a bad spirit. It's just a little bit disappointing, I think. Right. Okay. So let's sum this little tasting up. Quite interesting, I think you'll find. The Collingwood, I really like that. I think that's really interesting, and I must admit, it. Before doing the research on it, I hadn't realised that they basically stick these maplewood staves in the blending tank. But it's produced an interesting whisky. I think it's got sort of a very much grain-like kind of character. If you like grain whisky, it's got that sort of grainy kind of bite to it, a little bit of sweetness and honeyed character. I think. Yeah, I think overall that's not a bad whisky. It's not the most complex whisky. Don't think it's particularly old, but yeah, it's pleasant to drink. I think. 40 Creek Evolution. Well, it's interesting stuff. I think if you like that kind of whisky, if you like the sort of fairly heavily wine accented whiskies, then it's going to be right up your street. Personally, I'd like to have seen a little bit more balance, certainly to the palate. I'd like to have seen a little bit more spirit character. I don't think. I think obviously 9 years in ex-Cabernet Sauvignon cask was probably a few years too much, but that's just my own opinion on that particular one. The Slurs PX. Well, I think if the palate was like the nose. I think I would have been really, really impressed. I mean, I liked the nose. I thought the nose was really good. Yes, the spirit is fairly young, fairly youthful, but I thought it had a nice kind of balance with just a sort of smidgen of the PX character. The palate was a little bit more heavier on the PX, and I got probably more PX than I did of any kind of spirit. And yeah, I think it's certainly one to watch. I think it's a distillery to keep an eye on. I think obviously that the spirit they're producing is good quality spirit. It's interesting, and I think like a lot of the sort of new distilleries, whether they're in Europe or America or wherever, I think there's obviously the pressure on the distillery to get a product out, and whether it's maturing in small casks, quarter casks, finishing in wine casks or whatever. A lot of distilleries are trying these things out to try and get a product out, which is not a bad thing. It's always interesting to sort of taste and chart the evolution of a sort of a new distillery. Sometimes they're a little bit too expensive. I mean, I don't know what this retails for, and certainly some distilleries stuff I've tasted. You sort of look at the what you have to retail it for, and you think 80 quid for a 3-year-old whiskey. That's all right, a bit unusual, but but I'm not saying this is retailing for 80 odd quid. But the point being is that sometimes you don't want to spend 80 odd pounds on an experiment to see whether you like it or not, and you sort of taste it and you think, well, yeah, that's an interesting experiment, but anyway, you kind of get where I'm coming from. Smögen, really like that. I think that's excellent whiskey. Again, it just goes to show that some distilleries, whether it's by design, whether it's purely by fluke, that they have a really drinkable young spirit. And I think this had a nice complexity. You had elements of the spirit, you had elements of peat, elements of the two different cask types, and they all kind of came through. It was all quite harmonious. Again, I think this will be interesting to see as this progresses. I'd like to see this aged in American oak, purely American oak, and to get a kind of handle on the distillery character, and that's what I always like. And with distilleries, I'd like to know what the distillery character is like before I start sort of tasting all the weird and wonderful bottlings that they kind of do, and so you can see, well, am I picking it out? I mean, I'm guessing I'm getting some of it, that sort of quite herbal kind of character. I'm guessing that is the sort of the character of the spirit, but of course you don't know until you've either tasted the new make or you've tasted spirit just aged in American oak. So, but from this bottling, and this bottling isn't cheap, it has to be said. But I think going back to what I said about the paying 80 odd quid for an experimental whiskey, which might be just interesting, I think this is actually something you would quite enjoy drinking. Yes, it's interesting to see as what the whiskey's at, but I think it's not a weird experiment. It's just you pleasantly enjoy it. So, and while we're talking about too young and should have been given more time in the casks, then we come to the Stauning, and I think that is just shows you is a perfect example of a whiskey that's just bottled too young. There's no real cask interaction. It's still got the slightly fainty, off the still kind of character, which would be sort of removed by prolonged maturation in casks. And I think sometimes it just goes to prove the old adage that you can't rush whiskey maturation. You just have to let time do its thing. I know you want to get a product out there, get some sort of cash rolling in, and a lot of distilleries will do it by doing a gin or a vodka or something like that, which doesn't require any maturation period, and they can then sort of distill their whiskey and stick it in the warehouses and kind of just let it get on with it. So yeah, I think probably more so than any of the other whiskies that we've tasted today, I think the Stauning really does need some more time. I mean, it's got some obvious character, possibly, I guess. I think it's obviously good, clean spirit, but I just think it just needs a little bit more time. It needs some wood and what have you. So yeah, I think there you have it. Hopefully you've enjoyed this episode of the show. I think it was really interesting. So all that's left to say is thank you for watching. Good dramming and good afternoon.
Since the shadows of my life away, alone now my soul cries. All these misery. Take my thoughts and my prides away. Give me a chance to find